everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about some of the greatest treasure ever found on English soil. It's the Sutton Hoo helmet. You're going to absolutely love this story. It's about finding an ancient king in the back garden and about the world he lived in, a world of dragons, monsters and Scandinavians. So please remember to like, comment and subscribe. Now, the fact the helmet was ever found in the first place was thanks to a woman called Mrs. Edith Pretty, who was the daughter of a wealthy industrialist. She had lived in Sutton Hoo in Suffolk with her husband, a retired colonel, since 1926, and 12 years after she had been married to him, she found herself widowed and with a young son. Like lots of people in the 1930s, Mrs. Pretty was interested in spiritualism, and she had a friend who was a medium, and she also used to go to meetings with spiritualists. And there was this great big grassy mound on her land, lots of grassy mounds, and these hillocks were marked on maps as Roman burial mounds. And a guest who stayed with Mrs. Pretty had once claimed to see a ghostly warrior on horseback riding through the grounds. Now, whether this was true or not is slightly sketchy, but Mrs. Pretty was definitely curious about what was in those mounds. And an elderly labourer on the estate swore that the mounds contained treasure. She'd been to Egypt, so she did know a little bit about archaeology, and her curiosity got the better of her because she wanted to see what was inside the mounds. She got in touch with Ipswich Museum and they sent over an archaeologist called Basil Brown. He had a real interest in investigating ancient monuments, carefully with tools borrowed from Mrs. Pretty's household, a coal shovel, pastry brushes and a penknife. And just a few weeks after they started excavating the first mound, they uncovered the impression of a 27-metre ship, which had rotted away, so it was just the indentation that was left in the ground and some iron rivets. As they kept digging, the boat got bigger and bigger and bigger. And Basil Brown realised the ship they were uncovering was as big as the Scandinavian ships, and he quickly realised they were onto a very exciting discovery. He said later it felt like digging into a small mountain, and he wrote to his wife May that the middle of the vessel was as wide as our small room at home. Rumours about the ships started to spread, and soon the excavation party grew. Days after Basil Brown found the burial chamber, professionals from the University of Cambridge and the British Museum arrived at Sutton Hoo and demoted him to a minor role in the dig, which must have been pretty annoying. It became apparent that there was a burial chamber where someone had been buried, and these were often robbed at some point in history, but this one seemed like no one had disturbed it. And this find became the most important ever in British history. The burial chamber was overflowing with amazing objects. There were weapons, gold and garnet jewellery, containers, buckles from shoes and drinking horns, and it was a window into another world. This excavation was taking place in July 1939, and the team were under pressure to work quickly because war could break out at any moment. In some ways, this discovery was an emblem of Englishness, which maybe added to the feeling of urgency and patriotism as they dug. It maybe felt a bit like a rescue mission. And then they found the most important artefact of all, a rusted helmet. When the excavators opened the chamber, the helmet was smashed into tiny fragments. This means it must have been in a rusty condition, and it also means that the burial chamber would have been a very sturdy structure because it was able to support the weight of the mound and survive long enough for the helmet to rust away. The chamber would have then collapsed and the helmet broke into tiny pieces. But these pieces have been painstakingly pieced back together to form a terrifying helmet. And it's made out of iron, but it would have once been covered in tin panels. And this replica helmet shows what it would have looked like and how it would have looked to an approaching enemy. It's decorated with scenes of a horseman riding over a fallen soldier, and these warriors with their spears and semicircular headdresses. The face mask has human features, a cast bronze nose, mouth and eyebrows, but if you look closely you'll see that each eyebrow ends in a boar's head with pointed tusks, and there's also a dragon's head with sharp little teeth. So it's both human but would have transferred these animalistic qualities onto the wearer. It's extremely detailed and intricate. The garnets highlight the eyebrows, there's a toothbrush moustache, and this intricacy is painting a portrait of the person who wore the helmet. If you wear the replica helmet, it makes your voice deeper, which would have been more intimidating to an enemy. But who would have worn it? The conditions of the mound meant that there was nothing left of the person who wore this helmet. You have to imagine the ship buried in the ground like this is a container for water. So the water would have run through the soil and collected in the ship, and it would have picked up the acidity going through the sandy soil. So it was like the body was lying in an acid bath. The bones and the body would just have dissolved away. There's actually some debate about whether there was a body at all. There's been some phosphate traces found in the soil, and that would indicate that there was once a body. But those might have come from other sources, and it could have just been a shrine instead. You might think that the ship was placed in water, and maybe that the area used to be a stream or somewhere that was surrounded by water, but it's unlikely that was the case. Archaeologists think that the ship was dragged out of the river and then placed in a trench that had been specifically dug for it, and that it was actually buried 30.5 metres away from the river Deben. There might not have been a body, but the artefacts gave strong clues about whose grave it might have been. In a letter to Mrs. Pretty, Thomas Kenrick from the British Museum said that it was someone very special indeed. He said, "There is no doubt that the man in your barrow must have been a very important person, and we're beginning to wonder if he was King Redwald of East Anglia." King Redwald had ruled in the early 7th century, and if Kenrick was right, which most people think he is, it means that the ship burial had taken place nearly 1,400 years ago, or nearly 1,500 years ago today. We can never be certain who it is, but based on the age of the coins that were found in the burial chamber, and who was living prominently during that time, you can make a pretty strong case for King Redwald. Almost everything we know about Redwald is from an 8th century manuscript written by St. Bede. And according to Bede, some of these early English kings ruled other kings. It's thought that Redwald was one of them and basically had an empire in the south of England. At the same time, England was divided into a series of kingdoms, although the strongest king would claim to be the Bretwalda, making them the ruler of the others. And the lavishness of the grave, and even some of the items in the grave, suggest that it could be him, especially as the dates are spot on. Here's something that will put the wealth of this person into context. This gold belt buckle weighs just over 400 grams, which would have cost about 300 Anglo-Saxon shillings. The thing that's significant about this is that we know from the law codes at the time that 300 shillings was the life price of a nobleman. So it was the price that would be paid when a nobleman was killed. And this means that the king, whoever he was, would have been able to just walk about with the price of a nobleman's life on his belt. And there were no crowns with prongs as we know them today. They didn't come into fashion until the 10th century. Before then, it was the sword and the helmet which defined the monarchy. And although burying a man with these objects is an act of honour and remembrance, it also shows that the royal family in East Anglia could just afford to drop all this gold into the ground, so they must have been extremely wealthy. It's thought the helmet was actually an heirloom passed down the family for about a century. The helmet has repairs on the back, which suggests it had a bit of use before it was put in the grave. There's no way of knowing whether it would have been worn in battle, and although it's highly decorative, it would have worked as a functional piece of armour. It's got nostrils so you could breathe while you were in battle. And we know that King Redwald fought once in the Battle of the River Idle, and in his manuscript, Bede says Redwald marched his troops 250 miles to Northumbria to face his enemy Ethelthrift in the year 616. And Redwald defeated his enemy but lost his son, Regan, in the battle. And Redwald himself might even have died in a later battle, we just don't have enough information to know. At first sight, the ship burial looked like it was a Scandinavian boat. Ships like this had only been discovered before in Sweden. And the helmet looked Scandinavian too, like the Vendel 14 helmet from Uppland, with its ear flaps and eyebrows. But a closer look at the Sutton Hoo helmet showed some important differences. It was actually made in one whole piece, whereas the construction of the Swedish helmets showed that they were made from several different bands of iron. And because of these differences, it's thought that this helmet was probably made in England and not Scandinavia. Despite its possible English roots, the helmet is covered in images from Scandinavian mythology, like these dancing warrior panels. Each warrior is dragging a foot and has spears and a short sword, and they're thought to be associated with the cult of Odin, who was the war god. Their trailing outer legs are meant to suggest that they're moving towards each other, movement something that's really difficult to depict in art, so this is how the Anglo-Saxons have chosen to show it, and it looks like these warriors are dancing together. It's thought that these kind of dances were part of Scandinavian rituals, somewhere between a dance and a fight, which were performed at important gatherings. Undoubtedly, anyone wearing this helmet would also be hoping that the successful warriors on the armour would translate into their own performance on the battlefield. The Scandinavians were not the only mighty warriors who influenced this helmet. The Romans had left Britain in the 5th century, but their influence was still being felt a century or two later. This fallen warrior design, where the man on horseback is riding over his conquered enemy, has its roots in the Roman period. And the helmet's shape also borrows heavily from Roman parade helmets. Most of these early English kings were successful warriors, and some of them would have been the sons of Scandinavians or Germanic tribes, who had commanded parts of Anglo-Saxon Britain. For many, though, they would have imagined or romanticised themselves descending from the Romans, and that they descended from Caesar. That's perhaps why Redwald would have chosen to show his alleged roots. Redwald would also have been exposed to Christianity. Bede tells us that a Christian missionary landed on the Isle of Thanet in Kent in 597, and that Redwald spent quite a lot of time in Kent, and he'd probably have come into contact with Christianity. Apparently, having adopted the religion, he returned to his kingdom, but also partially returned to paganism, or he at least decided to start backing both horses. He supposedly had 2 altars, one to the Christian god and another to the pagan god Woden. The grave reflects that with mostly pagan artefacts, but the man was also buried with 2 spoons, which read Solus and Polus, so Saul and Paul, which are 2 biblical characters. By contrast, the helmet doesn't contain any Christian symbolism. There it says, "In the name of Lord Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, and God to all, we say Amen." So whoever wore it probably thought that that inscription was bringing protection to the wearer. And it's probably the same with the Sutton Hoo helmet, but the Scandinavian symbols are meant to provide the same kind of protection. When it was found, people were instantly reminded of the great Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf. Until 1939, it had been taken for granted that Beowulf was pretty much a fantasy world of warriors and great feasts. But the Sutton Hoo ship, with its cauldrons, drinking horns, and this helmet, was evidence that Beowulf was not just a nice poem, it was an accurate description of a vibrant, ancient world. And this is a little excerpt from Beowulf, and see if it reminds you of anything. "To guard his head, he had a glittering helmet that was due to be muddied on the mere bottom and blurred in the upswell. It was of beaten gold, princely headgear hooped and hasped by a weaponsmith who had worked wonders in days gone by and adorned it with boar shapes. Since then it had resisted every sword." Until the summer of 1939, there was basically a 400-year gap in history from when the Romans left in about 410 AD and then the first Viking raids in the late 700s. So this burial ship both legitimised Beowulf and became the only physical object in the middle of this time gap. When the burial was first discovered, a treasure trove inquiry found that everything belonged to Mrs. Pretty because it was found on her land and she had funded the whole excavation. She immediately gave it all to the British Museum, and she was offered the honour of Dame of the British Empire, but she refused it. And with a fortnight of the inquest, war had broken out. Battle practice was carried out on the land where all these mounds were located, and it was in an area called Sutton Heath. Tanks actually drove right through the ship, so that when it was re-excavated, you could see the tyre marks where the tanks had been. During the war, the British Museum moved many of its treasures to London Underground stations, and the helmet, which was still in 500 pieces, was boxed up and spent the 6 years underground. When war was over, it took 2 years to construct the helmet, and then it was displayed in the Festival of Britain. The festival was basically showing off the best of Britain after the war, and the helmet acted as a big sign of the monarchy and the beginning of the empire. But there was a growing feeling that the helmet had perhaps been put back together wrong because it didn't work properly as a helmet. The sides of the face and the throat would have been left completely unprotected, and the dragon at the back was stuck to the helmet and the neck guard, and that stopped it being flexible and pretty much imprisoned the wearer. All these things led to the helmet being dismantled and put back together again, a complete headache. The job fell to a man called Nigel Williams, who was a British Museum curator, and he was given the job in 1971. He had a breakthrough when he found another dragon head which was similar to the ones on the crest. And according to a BBC documentary, the dragon head sat on his desk for about 8 months as he absorbed the shapes and the details into his subconscious. One day he realised the dragon fit between the eyebrows, and this also unveiled another layer of symbolism in the face mask. Suddenly, the features were not just features, they became part of the dragon, a winged dragon. The eyebrows were wings, the nose was a body, and the moustache became the dragon's tail. And I just think this is perfect. It gave me goosebumps when I first heard that. If you want to see this amazing piece of history, it's on permanent display in room 41 of the British Museum, so please go and say hi to it from me. And it's just such a fascinating part of history. The Anglo-Saxons were mostly Germanic tribes who'd crossed the sea and taken up residence in England, and that's probably why they've chosen a ship burial for this well-respected leader, because ships were very important and big parts of their lives, and they would have been their main means of transport. People in Denmark and Holland would probably have seemed like close neighbours compared to people in other parts of the country. So that is my video on the Sutton Hoo helmet. I really hope you've enjoyed it. There's actually another really good video on the sword by the British Museum, so go and check that out. I'll link it below. Please remember to like and subscribe my channel for more videos, and please share this video with a friend if you think someone would enjoy it. That's all from me today. Hope you're having a great time wherever you are. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.